Now in today's video we're going to be taking a look at what I think is one of the most unusual combinations to use, and it's not because it's something that I would actually use, it's actually something that many of you told me that you do, and it's pretty weird. Now whenever we do a video on either of these components, I tend to get comments from people saying they actually use them together, and it's a little bit unusual because there is a major difference between these two parts. For the CPU we have the AMD FX 8350. This was released in 2012. It is an 8-core processor, or that's at least what AMD says, and to be honest it wasn't the fastest CPU back then, but what it lacked in power it really made up for in heat. For the graphics card, we have the AMD Radeon RX 6700 XT. Now this released nearly 10 years later. It was actually released in 2021. And even though it wasn't the cheapest graphics card out there, it has actually started to become one of the best price to performance cards there are actually on the market. Now there is a big major difference between these two components, and I did find it's extremely unusual to put these things together, but people are doing it. Now of course, even on paper, this combination will suffer from a severe bottleneck on the CPU, but they will generally work together quite fine. I've actually had this card in a system with this FX processor and everything tends to work perfectly fine, but I'm actually more interested in what kind of experience people are getting. Well, of course, to find that out, I needed to do some testing. So let's take a look at some benchmarks of these two components together. So as you can see from the benchmarks, this combination of parts actually worked reasonably well together. People are genuinely playing games and they're probably doing it perfectly fine. What they're probably not realizing is the severe bottleneck that the CPU is actually providing, particularly if they've never tried nothing else, but it's clear to see in our benchmarking as we went up the resolutions. During our 1080p testing, you can see that we got reasonable results. The games were more than playable, or for most of them, particularly with the graphics card there. But if you do remember the last time we tested this graphics card, there is something that's going wrong. As we hit the 1440p resolution, we can see that the gap is actually shrinking, and some of the games even perform better in 1440p than they did in 1080. This is a clear indication of the bottleneck that the CPU is providing. It's not actually allowing the graphics card to get to its full potential, and to be honest, we can even see that when we hit the 4K results. We managed to get a pretty decent average across all of the games in 4K, which could be quite surprising to some, but then again, it is that CPU that is holding the GPU back. And it wasn't even just the performance you were getting. The games actually felt much more smoother and much more playable at those higher resolutions, so unless you are playing at those higher resolutions, you're probably not having the best experience. Weirdly enough, out of all the games we tested, Starfield actually felt quite smooth for once, which is quite phenomenal really with a combination like this compared to other things that we've tested, but again, it was only really on those higher resolutions where the performance wasn't enough really to get the game quite playable. So of course we know that the combination actually works, we can play games on it, and there is a severe bottleneck on that CPU, particularly as we go up the resolutions, because we can see that the results don't really change that much. The gap shrinkens and shrinkens as we go up them. In actual fact, some of the games perform better in a higher resolution than they did in a low one. But what are gamers actually missing out on? Well, of course, we recently tested the 6700 XT with a much higher processor, a much newer one, and the results are completely different. Comparing this setup to a more modern CPU, the Intel Core 12700K, we can see that in 1080p we more than doubled all of our performance across all of the games that we tested, and in fact in some of the more demanding and modern games we actually tripled the performance here. A good example of this is in God of War, where with the FX 8350 we managed to get an average FPS of 28 with a 1% low of 21, but with the 12700K and the RX 6700 XT we managed to get an average of 135 frames per second with a 1% low of 117. That wasn't a unique case here because we've actually got even more. In Spider-Man Remastered with the FX 8350 we managed to get an average of 41 frames per second with a 1% low of 24. That would actually border not playable due to those really poor low 1% lows, but with the 12700K we managed to over triple that by getting 143 on average with a 1% low of 80. That was also seen in The Last of Us Part 1, where with the FX 8350 we managed to get an average of 34 frames per second with a 1% low of 21. That kind of seems average for many systems out there, to be honest, with that kind of game, because it is extremely demanding. But again, once we actually pair the 6700 XT with the 12700K, we could see that we could get an average of 107 frames per second with a 1% low of 64. Now this is a phenomenal result when it comes to 1080p, but what does it look like as we go up the resolutions? In 1440p we can see that the gap starts to close now, with the FX 8350 getting some pretty decent results here, more than playable across the board. The only one game that really stood out here was The Last of Us Part 1, where we got a much worse 1% low of 18, even though the average FPS was pretty much the same. But again, with the 12700K we managed to get an average of 67 frames per second with a 1% low of 55. That means that the gap is shrinking, but we are still getting more than double the performance with the new processor. As we continue to step up the resolutions here, going up to 4K, the FX 8350 again performed reasonably well in comparison to its previous resolutions, and that is because the CPU is now becoming less of a bottleneck as we go up. But again, the 12700K does start to outpace it. Now the results here are much closer, and that is because we are starting to take the demand from the CPU and we're putting it onto the graphics card, and the graphics card's really starting to show what it can do at that kind of resolution. In 4K on the FX 8350 in Back 4 Blood we managed to get an average of 53 frames per second with a 1% low of 26. With the 12700K that was only 58 frames per second with a 1% low of 27. So as you can see, and the pattern continues on from here, they are so close that in actual fact if you are gaming at 4K with an FX 8350 and an RX 6700 XT, which I wouldn't recommend to do anyway because that card really is a 1440p card, you are actually getting a pretty decent result, even though your 1% lows are going to slightly suffer across the board. Now I find those results actually quite interesting because it is a great example of a CPU bottleneck all the way throughout. As we go up the resolutions, things become better, and when we start comparing old CPUs to modern CPUs, you can see they get a lot more closer, and that's because the graphics cards are really doing all of the work. It's quite interesting to see what people are using out there, and I always thought this was a very unique and weird case. But clearly people are having fun with it because it is generally working. The one thing I would suggest to anybody out there with an FX CPU who are thinking about upgrading the graphics card, it all massively depends on the resolution that you expect to game at. If you are expecting to game at those low resolutions, you clearly do not need an RX 6700 XT. You can get away with a much slower and older graphics card and you will still get the exact same performance. And that's because The RX 6700 XT in this configuration isn't even really getting utilized. We managed to actually see throughout most of our testing at those low resolutions, the RX 6700 XT barely hit 50% utilization. And that is a clear sign that you can get away with buying a slower graphics card. If you do want a more modern graphics card with a platform like this, I suggest that you look at the AMD Radeon 5000 series or the AMD Radeon 6000 series, but a much lower spec card. I wouldn't bother with anything like the RX 6400 or 6500 XT, and that's because on this platform you're not going to have the PCI generation enough to actually get those cards utilized properly. So I would recommend taking a look at something like the RX 5700 XT. Still a very good graphics card today, and I still think that you'd probably see quite a bit of a bottleneck there, even though you wouldn't have spent so much on a graphics card. Or the AMD Radeon RX 6600. Now maybe we should do some testing with this configuration with the 6600 and just kind of compare the results sometime, but that's going to be for another video. Let me know in the comments below what you think of this combination, and are you one of the people that actually do use this? Tell me what kind of resolutions you're playing at, and did anything in this video actually surprise you enough to want you to upgrade the platform? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you like this kind of content, and I'm sure as always we'll catch you guys in the next one.